Vande Mataram, Namaste Bharat. Welcome to another round of the Law Club webinar series. Today we have with us Shri Ashish Chavanji. Ashish sir has given several webinars for the Law Club. In fact, last time he did appeals and this time he will be doing revision under CRPC. The plus point of Ashish sir is that he is one of the few lawyers whom we just have to tell that students need your expertise and he is always available. One of the rare gem of a person who is available for us to update us on law and especially on criminal laws. Ashish sir, thank you for being kind upon us and request you to enlighten us on the revision in CRPC.
Yeah, so at the very beginning, a good evening to all of you. And it is really an honor and a privilege to be here before you for the fourth consecutive time. This is the fourth time that I am having the privilege of being hosted by the Law Club. And when we started off 2.5 months ago, when this whole lockdown started, and there was this talk about a webinar. I wondered, what a webinar will achieve. And I spoke very tentatively for the first time. I think it was on the topic of admissibility of electronic evidence. And I realized that the webinar, now it has been almost 2.5 months that we are in lockdown. And believe me, and I can say this with certain amount of conviction on behalf of all my fraternity, that we are really missing the courts. We are missing the courts, we are missing our briefs, we are missing our books, we are missing the robes, we are just missing being a lawyer. And so it is really heartening that when I'm invited to speak whatever little experience I have on topics of law, it actually takes me back to the books, and it really helps me sharpen my mind. So I believe that it is really necessary for us to have these kind of webinars so that all of us stay focused, stay positive during these difficult times. So without any further ado, I will start off with the topic that I want to talk about today, which is revision. So this revision is limited to the Code of Criminal Procedure. And on the last occasion, I was asked to speak about appeals and revisions. But while I was preparing for the topic, I realized that appeals by itself is a vast topic, a huge subject. I did my best to try to cover it on the last occasion. And on the last occasion itself, I was very clear that I will not be able to finish the entire topic of revision and appeal. So I decided to divide it into two parts. So the last time my talk went on for about an hour, and today it is going to be very, very short because, and that is really how I wanted to keep it. It is going to be very short and there will be a lot of time for asking questions, which is what the real purpose of these kind of webinars is. So that our skills are sharpened. So we'll start off. I'll just share the screen. And if there is any problem with the sharing of the screen, please let me know. So the first thing that we will be looking at right now is the statutory provisions. So what are the statutory provisions which deal with the concept of appeal in Code of Criminal Procedure? Now, just give me a minute. Just adjust my screen. Yeah. So, now chapter 30 of the Code of Criminal Procedure deals with the entire concept of revision. And sections 397 to 405 to be precise of the Code of Criminal Procedure deal with the statutory provisions on revision. So this is so far as the skeleton of CRPC is concerned, which provisions deal with revision. Now going ahead, this time what I have done is I have tried to the questions which were in my mind and which obviously would be in your mind also. and we will have a kind of a question answer session. So this is a question that I'm asking myself: which courts can entertain revision? So the answer is pretty simple. Both the High Court and the Sessions Court can entertain a revision application. But although the answer is simple, the next question is going to be a little bit tricky. Now, the answer to this question is actually what is very interesting. So what are the jurisdiction of the High Court and Sessions Court to entertain a revision application? Now, the jurisdiction of Sessions Court and High Court is concurrent and coextensive. Okay, so this means one can file a revision against an order of a magistrate court, which is the lowest court in the hierarchy of courts, either before the immediate next court, that is the Sessions Court, or the court that is the appellate court, that is which is the High Court. So if you, technically speaking, now here I am emphasizing on the word technically speaking, can file an order of a magistrate court either before the Sessions Court, which is the next court, or the High Court. But here I am going to discuss something which is the rule of practice. So you have a rule of law and you have a rule of practice. I will give you an analogy. You have read or studied the anticipatory bail, the law of anticipatory bail, section 438 of the CRPC. Now, what does it say? That technically speaking, a bail application can be filed either in the Sessions Court or in the High Court. So the jurisdiction is concurrent and coextensive. But does it mean that we file the anticipatory bail directly in the High Court? We don't. Why don't we do it? Because it's a rule of practice. So the rule of practice generally that is evolved after the law is actually put into practice, which basically tells us that since although these two jurisdictions are concurrent and coextensive, logically, even practically, if you look at it as even from the perspective of a lawyer, if you look at it practically, if you exhaust the remedy, if you don't file an application before the Sessions Court and you directly file before the High Court and it gets rejected, now there may not be a revision against revision, but if your application in the Sessions Court gets rejected, you do have a further remedy. But just imagine if your application, you move directly to the High Court and it gets rejected, your layer or rather opportunity or chronology of remedy is decreased. And this is the practical reason how the law of practice has evolved. So practically speaking, one files the revision from the magistrate court to the Sessions Court and not directly to the High Court, although there is no legal bar on it. And practically speaking, that is what comes to the next this thing. A revision against the Sessions Court obviously will lie to the High Court only. It can't go back to the magistrate court. So you have a principle where basically the jurisdiction of the Sessions Court and High Court is concurrent and coextensive. But the rule of practice is that normally a revision is first filed before the Sessions Court. And if you don't succeed there, then obviously we will come to that a little later. There can't be a revision against revision, but there are some other remedies which you can explore in the subsequent higher courts. That is the rule of practice. And if you have a revision which lies against or which arises from the order of a Sessions Court, where will it go? It will go to the High Court only. Okay, so we are still on the aspect of statutory provisions. Now, what are the general powers of a revisional court? What does the revision court look at? What does it, and what powers does it have? So, the first thing that a revisional court normally does after you file the revision application is, it can call for and examine the record of any proceedings of any criminal court in its jurisdiction. So, I have highlighted these two words: call for and examine. It is necessary for the court, it may not do it in every case, but normally it is necessary for the court to call for the record and proceedings, what we normally call in our lawyer parlance or language, that is the record and proceedings. So basically it can call for and examine the record of any proceedings of any criminal court in its jurisdiction. For the purpose of, so what is this entire exercise for calling the records? What is the be all and end all? What is the reason for it? The reason is that it is for the purpose of satisfying itself as to the legality, propriety, or correctness or regularity. So we have four words here. We have legality, we have propriety, we have correctness, and regularity of any order, finding, or sentence. So I think if you ask me, as a practicing lawyer, we need to focus on these 4 words, and that is the very essence and soul of the entire concept of revision. Is the order legal? Is the order proper? Is the order correct? Does it suffer from any irregularity? These are the 4 questions we are going to ask ourselves time and again when we look at an order and we think of going for a revision against it. Okay. So this is one of the powers of a revisional court. It can decide the or satisfy itself as to the legality, proprietary correctness or regularity. Then now the record is called for. Now what other ancillary powers does the revisional court enjoy? Now supposing there is a sentence which is running against the accused, or there is an order basically putting the accused behind bars. He is in custody. So at the time for filing of calling for the record, the revisional court in its revisional powers can suspend the execution of that sentence. So this is an ancillary power which is given to the revisional court. So what it do? It can suspend the execution of the sentence on order and release the accused on bail. So in short, it can grant bail to the accused if he is in custody. Now, very importantly, just as point number 1 is very important, point number 3 is extremely important. No interlocutory orders can be challenged by way of a revision. Now, what is this magic words, interlocutory orders? So there is a whole case law which has developed in India on the concept of what are interlocutory orders, what are final orders, what are intermediate orders. We'll see that a little later. Just bear in mind that no interlocutory orders can be challenged by way of a revision. Now, the law further says that if a complaint is dismissed, so in case of a dismissal of a complaint, or the accused is discharged, so or discharge of the accused, further inquiry can be initiated by the revisional court. Now, what is this further inquiry? So let us imagine a case where the complaint is dismissed. Under section 203, you normally get a provision of law where your complaint can be dismissed, or you have a situation where the accused is discharged. Now, in that scenario, if the revision application is filed, the revisional court can, after of course hearing you, initiate a further inquiry so as to find out whether there was a ground enough to dismiss the complaint on the facts which you have agitated. Now, very importantly, no inquiry can be initiated against the discharged accused. Now, imagine the accused is discharged. He doesn't know that you have gone in revision. And supposing the revisional court hears you, only you, and order, which really affects him prejudicially, that would not serve the purpose of law. So therefore, no inquiry can be initiated against the discharged accused without giving an opportunity to be heard. That is in keeping with the principles of natural justice. Okay, so we go ahead. Again, we are still on the concept of statutory provisions. What further does the law say? No order can be passed in a revision application without giving the aggrieved party opportunity to be heard. So this is the general principles of natural justice again. Now we come to the next question. Is there any difference in the powers of revision exercised by the Sessions Court and the High Court? A very interesting concept, because right at the beginning we say that the court and the Sessions Court have concurrent and coextensive jurisdictions. We also say that the High Court can entertain a revision application. The Sessions Court can also entertain a revision application. So naturally, logically, this question comes to mind that are there any difference in the powers of revision, or are they identical? The answer is yes. In addition to the revisional powers, the High Court can exercise the power of appeal in a revision application. Now, understand, we have last time dealt threadbare with the concept of appeal. So I needn't basically speak about appeal all over again. We know what an appeal is and what are the limitations and what are the powers of both the Sessions Court and High Court in an appeal. So just imagine, or just keep in mind that these powers of appeal can also be exercised by the High Court only, not the Sessions Court, by the High Court in a revision application, in addition to their powers in a revision application. So apart from being a revisional court, it can also exercise its powers as an appellate court. This is only restricted to the High Court The only limitation that it has is that the High Court cannot reverse a finding of acquittal into conviction. Okay, so this is the only impediment or only limitation is there. Apart from that, it can exercise all the powers that an appellate court has. Now, a very interesting question. Can a revision be filed against an order dismissing a revision application? So indirectly what I'm trying to ask is, can a revision lie against a revision application? So the answer is no. Now I've given an example that explained a little better. If A challenges a summoning order is order issuing process. So if A challenges a summoning order of a magistrate in the sessions court by way of revision, and the sessions court unfortunately dismisses the same. So the question is, can A file a revision against that order? The answer is A cannot file a revision against the order of dismissal because a revision against revision is not postulated in law. Now that doesn't mean that he does not have other remedies. Those other remedies, perhaps in some other lecture we can talk, but just for the sake of understanding, he can file a quashing petition under 482. And there are any other remedies that he can exercise depending on the facts of the case. But he certainly cannot file a revision against an order of revision. Now, what are the parameters? So therefore, now we are looking at the parameters of revision, powers of revision. Now, normally the parameters that the touchstone that we look at is that the judge should look at the question of law. So what basically needs to be argued in a revision application is whether there is any question of law, whether there is any palpable error. Palpable is on the face of it, and non-compliance with the provisions of law. So there is an apparent violation of the provisions of the law in the impugned order, or there is a glaring error, or it is a question of law and the decision is completely erroneous, where the judicial discretion is exercised arbitrarily. So these are the guide. I have culled this out from this judgment. Basically, I can just invite your attention to this judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in the matter of Amit Kapoor versus Ramesh Chandar, 2009 SCC 460. So I have culled out these principles from this particular judgment, but nevertheless, this judgment is just a indication of how the law has evolved, and there is a host of case law on this topic of what are the parameters of the revisional jurisdiction. So you have this particular concept. Then we move on to, so what do the courts in various judgments say? That the object of this provision is to set right a patent defect or an error of jurisdiction of law. So here we get one more point. That is why I have highlighted it. So you have a jurisdictional error which can be rectified by way of a revision. So these are the pointers. So then there has to be a well-founded error, and it may not be appropriate for the court to the order upon which the face of it bears a token of careful consideration and appear to be in accordance with law. So in short, what guidelines are given are: is it a question of law? Is there a palpable error? Are there any non-compliance with the provisions of law? Is the order completely erroneous? Is the discretion exercised completely arbitrarily? Is there any error of jurisdiction of law? These are the questions that you have to ask yourself when you look at the impugned order, which you want to go in revision against. Now, this is something which is not permissible. Now, what is not permissible? Appreciation and evaluation of the evidence is not permissible. So, there are disputed questions of fact. See, that is the last point that I have written. Disputed questions of fact not be argued in revision. So, revisional jurisdiction stays confined to the aspect of point numbers 1 and 2. The moment you invite the court's attention, or rather you invite the court to appreciate and evaluate the evidence, or you ask the court to go into the disputed questions of fact, you are liable to be thrown out of the court, because that is not the purview of a revisional jurisdiction. So appreciation and evaluation of evidence is certainly not permissible in a revisional jurisdiction. And the court has to restrict itself to the legality, propriety, and correctness. See, these three words will keep on coming back. legality, propriety, and correctness of the impugned order, because that is the very essence of what the revisional jurisdiction is all about. Now, where have we seen this before? Actually, I can just take your memory a little back. But first I'll read it. Where two views are reasonably possible and the court has taken the view in favor of the accused, the High Court should be slow in interfering in exercise of revisional jurisdiction suo motu in a revision against an order of acquittal. So this principle we gather also it is analogously and equally applicable in a case of an order, in a case of an appeal against acquittal. The same principle of law applies. When two views are reasonably favoring the accused must be taken. Now, okay, now this is the golden question in any revisional aspect. So what basically the law says that interlocutory order cannot be revised. So an interlocutory order is non-revisable. But the million-dollar question is, what is an interlocutory order? And again, we have to fall back on case law. So the first case law that we have to look at, or rather the enduring case law, because it is locus classicus. This is a 3-judge bench of the Honorable Supreme Court in the case of Madhu Limaye versus State of Maharashtra. I don't know whether even my generation would not really know Madhu Limaye, but if you look at a little bit of history, you will see that he was a very leading socialist leader of Maharashtra. And he was involved in a lot of beneficial litigation, I would say. And one of the gifts that he has given us is this very leading case of Madhu Limaye versus State of Maharashtra. Now, what does this case speak? For the first time, this entire gray area on interlocutory order was discussed in detail, and a lot of guidelines were given. So the first of all, the court starts with the legislative intent. Now, if you see the 73 code that we are reading now, prior to that, the old code did not have any bar on revision against interlocutory orders. That is why the Honorable Supreme Court starts by saying that the legislative intent on imposing a bar on revision against interlocutory orders seems to be that the higher courts were flooded with challenges to interlocutory orders, which used to lead to delays of proceedings. So this was the intention of the legislative intent behind imposing the bar, which is incorporated now on any revisional orders against interlocutory orders, revision against interlocutory orders. So basically that was the intention. So what used to happen earlier perhaps is that people used to rush to the courts to assail each and every interlocutory order, which is why the main proceeding used to suffer. And there used to be prolonged delays in the final disposal of the proceedings. So to overcome this challenge, the legislature chose to impose a bar against interlocutory orders. Now, what are these interlocutory orders? These are only pointers. Ultimately judgments are not mathematical equations. We know that. These are pointers basically, which help us determine or arrive at a conclusion as to what these interlocutory orders are. So they say an order which does not deal with the final rights of the parties. So this is the first clue that we get, that the final rights of the parties are not decided by an order. And the second clue that we get is it is made before the final judgment. Now I'm putting the word final because normally a judgment is final, but either is made before judgment, it is matters, but is merely on the matter of procedure. So we largely look at a scenario where there is a decision on the matter of procedure, but there is no final decision on the matter of dispute. So the subject matter of dispute could be, let us say, a property in a section 145 proceeding in CRPC. Although what is the final decision in that? Whether there is any apprehension of law and order arising out of some incident, and which is why 145 is rightly invoked or not. That is the final decision. But supposing there is some procedural application which is made during the course of the hearing, which does not finally decide the list or the issue between the parties, but what it does, it is merely gives a order either in A's favor or B's favor on the procedural aspect of it. Now, therefore, that order becomes something which is an interlocutory order. It is not a final order. The second clue or third clue that we get is it is made after the judgment. Now, this is one more scenario. It is made after the judgment and merely directs how the declaration of right already given in the final judgment are to be worked out is termed as interlocutory. Now, what is the second? First, we have understood. The second is, let us say, let me give you an analogy of a judgment wherein the judgment is passed, the sentence is passed, the sentence is suspended, and certain directions are given for the accused to comply with the, let us say, the bail formalities. The accused unfortunately cannot comply with the bail formalities. Maybe the bail is too high for him, or whatever be the reason. Technically, that order, which is after the judgment, technically it is after the judgment, but it is why is it passed? It is directing how the declaration of, so basically it is setting the accused or it is convicting the accused, but it is also suspending the sentence. So in furtherance of that right that it has already given the accused, it will say something ancillary or incidental. And that is why that order becomes interlocutory. So if you want to challenge that order, technically a revision will not lie, although it is made after the judgment. So then the next line is, an interlocutory order, though not conclusive of the main dispute, may be conclusive as to the subordinate matter with which it deals. Okay. Now we move on to the next, again a classic, locus classicus, V.C. Shukla. I believe he was a minister in the Indira Gandhi cabinet. And this is a judgment which again is a very landmark judgment in the aspect of interlocutory orders. So after the earlier judgment of Limay, we find V.C. Shukla, which again discusses this whole concept threadbare and adds something more to it. Now let us see what it adds. So Madhu Limay's case finally speaks of three categories of orders: final order, intermediate order, and interlocutory order. Now we understand what interlocutory order is. We also know what final order is, because it finally puts a rest to the rights and liabilities or the list or the dispute, the main dispute between the parties. So this is intermediate order. Intermediate order is something which is a gray area. You can't have either an interlocutory order or a final order or judgment. There will be something in between. Now, those something in between orders are technically the intermediate orders. Now, intermediate orders, are they final orders? No. Are they interlocutory orders? No. So, do we categorize them into final order category? Yes. So, basically, they are non-interlocutory orders. So, for our simple understanding, there are interlocutory orders and there are non-interlocutory orders. Those non-interlocutory orders could be either a final order or an intermediate order. Now, this is very interesting. The Supreme Court itself says that it is neither advisable nor possible to make a catalogue of orders to demonstrate which kinds of orders would be merely, purely, or simply interlocutory and which kinds of orders would be final, and then to prepare an exhaustive list of those type of orders which fall in between the two. So therefore, this exercise is not something which the Supreme Court is actually happy in doing, because it would be unending virtually, because you can't have a situation where you conjure up or imagine all kinds of scenarios where there would be a interlocutory order and where there would be a final order and prepare an exhaustive list, because it will never be exhaustive. It will keep on growing. So therefore, it would all depend on the facts of that case, whether you look at an order and then decide whether it is interlocutory, intermediate, or final. Now we come to V.C. Shukla. So in the subsequent case of V.C. Shukla, the apex court discussed the entire case law on interlocutory order and observed that the test for determining the finality of an order is whether the judgment or order finally disposes of the rights of the parties. So this is what we have been saying. So whether it finally disposes of the rights of the parties. If it does, it's a final order. If it doesn't, it's an interlocutory order. It is these principles, do they apply to civil as well as criminal cases? Yes, they apply both. V.C. Shukla says so. In criminal proceedings, the word judgment is intended to indicate the final order in a trial, terminating in the acquittal or conviction of the accused. So normally this is the clue that if it's a judgment, it is going to be 100% a final order. Now we come to, since this is what I really find very interesting. When there are smaller topics, you really can go into the depth of it. So we are going deep down into the various aspects of a revision now. So very interesting question arises is that can defense documents be considered in revision? And this is a vexing question. Practicing lawyers will understand. This question keeps on cropping up every now and then. Which document should I annex? What document should the court consider? Okay, so I'm giving you an example because it is easy to explain by an example. Let us take the example of an order issuing process, so which is popularly called the summoning order. It is a settled position of law that the order issuing process is not an interlocutory order and therefore it can be challenged in revision. That we needn't bother our heads because it's a settled position of law. Now we come further. So what is the answer to that question? The answer to that question can be found in the opening lines of section 397 itself. The revisional court can call for the record of the trial court. So what we popularly call as a record and proceeding. And what will it examine? It will examine the record and proceedings only. And normally now in this example, now this line is limited only for that example. Please understand. Now in that example, what will the record consist of? It will consist of the complaint, its annexures, and the verification statement. So are there any defense documents there? No. So the question that I posed here is, can the accused who's challenging the process file documents in his defense? So let us say he has got some 100% defense documents. So he says that why should I face the trial? The order issuing process is bad. I have got documents to show that the order is issued erroneously. I will show those documents and satisfy the court. Is that how the court is going to look at it in a revisional jurisdiction? The answer is no, it cannot. Why it cannot? Because the revisional court cannot go into disputed questions of fact. Because you are saying that this document is correct, I am saying that this document is not correct. In any case, that document is not established in a court of law through proper mode of proof. And therefore, it is not forming part of the record. Now imagine a situation where it forms part of the record. Let us say there is a final order which you are challenging by way of a revision, where let us say, for example, an order under 145, to continue with my previous example. Now there is an evidence which is laid from both sides. There is an inquiry which is conducted by the magistrate. There are documents which are filed, your documents as well as the other side's documents. Are we saying that these other side documents cannot be considered? No, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that documents which do not form part of the record, by record I mean the record and proceedings of the trial court, those documents cannot be considered, because otherwise you are going into disputed questions of fact. There is an exception. I am not going into judgments. There are a host of judgments from the last time. But the principle, that proposition that one can cull out from those judgments are that essentially that there is an exception. And what is the exception? Those documents, even though they are defense documents, if they are either public documents, the definition is there in CRPC, what is a public document, of sterling quality or beyond suspicion. So basically documents which are unimpeachable. The word that Supreme Court uses often is unimpeachable. So if there are these categories of documents which are unimpeachable, you simply have to look at those documents because they are public documents or they are sterling quality beyond suspicion, or sometimes in some cases they are undisputed documents. Then certainly they can be looked at. Okay. Now I have come to the end of my talk. So I will just sort of share with you how this is the way a revision petition should be drafted. Over the 19.5 years that I have been practicing, I have tried to cull out the various drafting styles, see works, and try to adopt a uniform formula for drafting. I'll just try to share some of my experiences, thoughts, and the way I look at the way I draft revision applications or petitions. And I'm sure some of you may benefit from it. So first of all, the first thing that, or I think everyone should see, is to ascertain whether the order that you are challenging is a non-interlocutory order, because the whole thing revolves around that. That is the very Atma, it's the very soul of a revision application. So first you have to ascertain, determine whether it's a non-interlocutory order or an interlocutory order. Now, perhaps you will ask me, how do you determine that? So you have to read up on that. Supposing there are precedents, saying that the summoning order is a final order, it can be revised. So you'll have to read that if there's a judgment on that point. So basically, this will involve research on whether the order that you propose to challenge is a non-interlocutory order or not. Then obviously you have to obtain either the certified or authenticated copy depending on where you are filing it. Filing the revision application, you have to obtain it and study it, read it, needless to say. Set out the facts leading to the filing of the revision application clearly and chronologically. See, I am emphasizing on both the words, clearly and chronologically. Clearly, I'll come to a little bit later, but chronologically is important. What happens is, while drafting many a times, and this happens to me, we will have to first set out the chronology of how the facts are evolving, what we call as the factual matrix. It starts from events, it is not just a random organization of facts. They start from events and they have to have a flow. So when I was interning and when I was with my senior, I believe I remember him always telling me this, that ultimately you must tell a story in your pleading. And this I have not forgotten till now. You will have to make your narrative. Ultimately, a pleading is also a narrative. And that narrative is going to be read first by the judge before he is going to hear you. So however much a judge may be busy, normally a judge does find time to go briefly through your pleadings. So the first impression that you make on the court is your pleadings and draft. So if your draft has a narrative which makes for engaging reading, it need not be story-like, it need not be fanciful. Of course, you have to avoid all that, but it has to have a flow, it has to have a narrative. And there is a lot of emphasis that I place when I draft on the on a revision or any petition, even a bail matter or any other writ petition. It has to have a flow and a narrative which is chronologically arranged. Now I'll emphasize on the word clearly. But before that, this is one more point which I always keep in mind, is that I avoid the temptation to discuss my legal points in my factual narration. So what happens is, when you are narrating facts, it has a flow, and that flow, according to me, of course, that is my view of it, that flow gets disrupted the moment you try to insert your legal arguments into it. Okay, so this is something which I avoid, and you can decide for yourself what best works for you. But normally I avoid making my legal submissions within my factual narration. I just try to make it simple and factual. Now, this is the connection between 3 and 5. Set out all relevant facts clearly. Do not play hide and seek. It gives a wrong impression about the applicant. Now, this is something which I cannot, stop emphasizing about. Because normally, these days, the first allegation, the first skirmish between the lawyer occurs when they say, no, you have not pleaded this. You have suppressed this from the court. And the word suppression has become, almost like, it's become like a pause or a punctuation mark. So I have always followed this thing, that even though some documents, some facts may be a little thorny, they may be a little uncomfortable for you, but you will have to deal with them. And believe me, I have always, it has always worked, rather than having a surprise package at you from the other side, plus the tarnishing of the reputation that happens in court when the other side says, but this is not needed, this is not annexed, this is not even talked about. So even if those facts are against you, you will have to deal with them. How you deal with them, your sugar coated words, how you sort of get over the hurdles, is something which is an art of advocacy. So that is something which everybody has his own touch. But the general take-home message that I would like to give here is that please don't hide facts, because that really doesn't help you in the long run. And it certainly gives a very wrong impression about your client. So now the grounds. So I consider the grounds as the very soul of any kind of a draft or a petition in anywhere. So it's a revision application or any other application or petition that you draft. The grounds are very, very important. even they will have to be set out chronologically. And it is here that you narrate or correlate the facts with the law. So let us say you are making a factual statement. Now, what is the legal consequence of that factual statement? It will be in your ground. That is how I drafted. So the correlation of facts with the law happens largely in the grounds. This is something which I can't keep on telling you again and again, which is to focus on the three words, which are the very soul of the revisional powers granted to the courts, which is legality, propriety, and correctness. So when you are impugning the order, please look at these words again and again and ask yourself whether it is legal, proper, correct, regular, and then only draft the petition. Avoid disputed questions of fact, which of course I have already dealt with. So I think I have come to an end, and it is 6:15, so it is almost 45 minutes now. I think I have covered most of what I wanted to cover. So I'll stop sharing. And I can invite, I'm throwing open the house for any questions that are there. I think I've already got 4 questions. Oh, the disturbing audio. I really have no control over it, Jyoti. But I hope, now at least I'm audible. Please guide on interlocutory order. I think I have mentioned sufficiently on interlocutory order. If there is any specific query, you can certainly ask me. Then Kalyani Joshi is asking which remedy is available to challenge interlocutory order. Interlocutory order 482, madam. 482, if there is, so the first question is whether it is appealable. No. The second question is, it is revisable. No. Then obviously you are at a situation where you have to invoke the inherent powers of the court, high court, and the inherent powers of the high court are saved by way of section 482, which is popularly called as a quashing petition. So you file a quashing petition. Now, we have a very nice lecture, sir. Thank you, Advocate Dheeraj. An order passed deciding the applications filed under 451 or 457 comes into the purview of interlocutory order. I believe there is a judgment on this, and I think I may be subject to correction, but I think that 451 and 457 are final orders, so that they are definitely revisable. But you will please check the law, because I think that is what the position of law is. Oh, thanks a lot, everyone, for being so kind enough to, because sometimes it does get boring. So when I was a student in law, my teacher always used to say that if there are no doubts, then there are 2 assumptions or 2 conclusions that the teacher can make. Either everybody has understood everything or nobody has understood anything. So I don't think, I just hope and pray that the second is not true. I believe that I have been clear and lucid for everyone to understand. But still, if there are any difficulties, let me know. I think we have some more time, if I'm not wrong.
So there is a question. Explain division, review, appeal difference.
Revision, review, appeal difference. Okay. Appeal I have already covered. So I'll stick to revision and reference. Yeah, reference is when there are 2 situations which arise of a reference. Either the trial court, when it is deciding with a complex question of law, cannot decide it, and it refers the matter or the question of law to a higher court. That is one way of looking at reference. The other reference is what you normally find when there is a division or when there is a conflict of judicial opinions. So there are 2 single bench views on a particular position of law, and the third bench may then refer it to a higher bench to resolve that particular issue. Difference between appeal and revision, Kalyani Joshi. The answer is very simple actually, and this is the way I have remembered it since I was a student. Appeals are provided for. So if you look at the CRPC and you don't find a provision for appeal, then you forget about appeal. Because if there is no provision in law for appeal, that is what the opening part of the appeal chapter says, that if there is, unless provided for, there is no appeal. So if there is no statutory provision for appeal, then your mind should start racing towards either revision, or if there is no revision, then 482. So that is how I would look at the difference between appeal and revision. Order of application under 143 of NI Act is interlocutory order. That we'll have to see the law, madam. I really, Lalit, sorry. We will have to see what the law is. I wouldn't offhand be able to tell you that. What is the difference between intermediate order and interlocutory order? So for simple understanding, let us divide interlocutory and non-interlocutory orders. That is the first division we make. We know what interlocutory orders are, and we know what non-interlocutory orders are. Now, in the non-interlocutory orders, you have final orders, which are judgments. So let us say there is a judgment of conviction. It is a final order. And there is an interlocutory. I'll give you an example of interlocutory order, especially for criminal lawyers. You have a situation where you have recall of witnesses. Okay, so you make an application before the judge saying that there are some points because of which I feel that there is a necessity of recalling the witness, and you make an application to file to recall the witness. The judge rejects it. Now, if you look at the case law on this point, the courts have held it to be a interlocutory order. So this is so now you know the two extremes. One extreme is interlocutory order, the other extreme is a final order. Anything which falls into between these two situations, madam, is an intermediate order. So I think I have answered your question satisfactorily. Whether there is an option to file revision or writ, or in some cases it can be allowed. So as I said, writ is when everything else fails. So whenever you draft a writ petition, you always say that I have no other alternative and efficacious remedy. That is the answer to that question. So if there is a appeal maintainable, if there is a revision maintainable, normally the courts would not entertain a quashment or a writ or a quashing petition, as we popularly call it. So I think that answers your question, Dheeraj.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, Ashish, sir. It was an excellent, perfect, and as expected from you, the one of the best deliveries of knowledge. Thank you very much on behalf of Law Chamber of Siddharth Murarka and the Law Club. We thank you for sparing so much of time for ensuring that we juniors and even students get updated in the field of law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and keep calling me.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.